teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, said Jesus. In other words, Jesus tells his disciples to make disciples the way he had made disciples, the way he'd made them disciples. Because Jesus knew perfectly well that it's no good just bringing people to conversion and repentance and leaving it there. Jesus knew, he tells us it in his parable, that the seed needs deep soil. It needs good roots in order to grow and bear fruit. So churches need not only to get planted through evangelism, they also need to be watered through teaching. And the Great Commission mandates both of them. This quote that's on the screen is from Professor Andrew Walls, a professor of mission, who was asked at a conference I was at to give a history of theological education. The conference was about theological education and mission. And I loved his opening sentence in his paper, because everybody thought he would start with, maybe the early church or, Clement of Alexandria or something like that. But he went right back, and his first sentence was, the Old Testament is the oldest and longest program of theological education. I loved that. It went on, as a curriculum that lasted about 1,500 years, and they still failed at the end. But what was God doing in the Old Testament? He is teaching his people. He takes this nation of Israel and he spends generation after generation teaching them through the Torah, the law, and the prophets, and the history, and the wisdom, and the Psalms, and so on, teaching them the truth about God himself, about creation, about sin, about salvation. All the great words of our faith are there in the scriptures of the Old Testament. All the words that are so precious to us: redemption, grace, love, salvation. God is teaching these things to his people. So it's not surprising, therefore, that when Jesus comes along, he is a teacher. He spends 3 years teaching his disciples. In fact, they called him rabbi. He was so much more than that, but he certainly was a teacher. And often in the Gospels you read, that's what he's doing, teaching the people, teaching the people. And then you look at the Apostle Paul, because of course we know that Paul was the great missionary church planter. No, back one, there we go. And we see Paul in the New Testament as a missionary. Of course he was. He was a church planter. But he didn't stop being a missionary when he sat down to write letters to the church. He didn't stop being a missionary when he decided that he would stay in Ephesus and spend nearly 3 years teaching them. In fact, he transformed that little group of disciples that he met into a flourishing urban church with many households within it. And he tells us in Acts, in his speech to the elders, that he had not hesitated to teach them, to preach to them the whole counsel of God and everything that was needful for them. And as I say, that was part of Paul's mission. He wasn't stopping being a missionary when he, as it were, stayed with the church to nurture them and to teach them. And when he couldn't do it himself, he made sure that others did. Look at his missionary team, people like Timothy and Titus, who were commissioned by Paul to teach others who would teach others also. Or one of my favorite characters, although a very minor one, in the New Testament, Apollos. I like Apollos because he was a cross-cultural missionary. We read at the end of Acts chapter 18 that he came from Africa, because he was brought up in Alexandria in Egypt, and he was a Jew who had a very thorough knowledge of the Scriptures, meaning the Old Testament, but he had come to faith in Jesus. And then he goes from Africa to Asia for some further theological education, which he receives from Priscilla and her husband Aquila in their home. And then when he's learned the faith more fully, he gets sent to Europe, to Greece, to the church in Corinth, from Africa to Asia to Europe. And in Europe, what does he do? He engages in what we would call theological education. Luke tells us at the end of Acts chapter 18 that he was refuting the Jewish opposition in public debate, proving from the Scriptures, meaning the Old Testament Scriptures, that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ. In other words, in terms of our theological curricula, Apollos was engaged in apologetics, Old Testament hermeneutics, and Christology. He was a theological educator. He was a learned man teaching the church. Now, when the church in Corinth split over whether people liked Paul, the church planter, or Apollos, the better lecturer, in their courses, and said, no, I'm a Paul, I prefer Apollos, Paul wouldn't have it. Paul says that's ridiculous, that's nonsense. In 1 Corinthians, he says, who is Paul? Who is Apollos? He said, we're just servants of God. He says, I planted the church, yes, Paul was the church planter, cross-cultural missionary evangelist. And Apollos watered the church. Yes, he was the cross-cultural missionary teacher of the church, the theological educator. But Paul says, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5 to 8, he says that evangelist planter, the one who plants, and the one who waters, he says, have one purpose, one mission. The task is one. Teaching is part of the mission of the church. And so I would want to urge very significantly tonight, as strongly as I could, because I know that some of you here are students in theological colleges, some of you are lecturers in theological colleges. I want to argue that the teaching ministry of the church, which includes, although not exclusively, of course, theological education, is an intrinsically missional thing to be doing, in obedience to the Great Commission. This is Great Commission stuff. Jesus says, teaching them to observe. It's not an extra. It's not just some ancillary thing. You know, we've got real mission over here, and you know, seminaries, you come in and spoil it, all sort of thing. It's not that kind of dichotomy between mission and theological education. If we take Jesus seriously in what he says in the Great Commission, then the teaching function of the church, which ought to include theological education as part of its formal aspect, although many other aspects as well, of discipling and so on, has to be included within our obedience to the Great Commission. And once again, for the last time this evening at least, the Cape Town Commitment actually picks this up, because at the Cape Town Congress in October 2010, there was a track which was devoted to this, the relationship between theological education and mission. And it says this: the mission of the church on earth is to serve the mission of God. And the mission of theological education is to strengthen and accompany the mission of the church. So it fits within the mission of the church. Theological education engages in spiritual warfare as we, quote, demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And then it continues, those of us who lead churches and mission agencies need to acknowledge that theological education is intrinsically missional, and those of us who provide theological education need to ensure that it is intentionally missional, since its place within the academy is not an end in itself, but to serve the mission of the church in God's world. So the relationship between the two is very deep.